Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Ryan Sandell, and I'd like to welcome you to the 13th week of this Introduction to Phonology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. This week, we're going to be touching on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, or close to my research interests, I should say, namely the assignment of stress, or in other words, in certain languages, how do we determine which segment, group of segments, or as we'll see, probably best to say which syllable stands out as the most prominent within a phonological word. Next week, when we come to talking about tone and intonation, we'll be able to put stress into the context of a larger typology of prosodic features, so to say, that is sorts of phonological features, so-called suprasegmental information, features that occur above the level of the segment in general. So today, we're first going to touch on talking about what exactly stress is, how we know and in what cases we think we need to talk about stress in a language, then how we formulate stress rules, and finally, we'll talk about the distinction in weight in syllables. For those of you who have ever studied any languages like Latin or Sanskrit or ancient Greek, you've probably seen a distinction in weight in segments, and indeed in the phonological analyses of many present-day languages, and present-day European languages, such as, say, German, length plays an important role. In length in segments plays an important role, length in vowels, and even in English, the distinction in weight of syllables does have some effect on stress rules as well. For next week, we'll look at the last chapter of Hayes, that is the chapter on tone and intonation. This week, if you're following the course, the 5th homework assignment is due on Wednesday before our exercise session, and the 6th homework assignment will be made available the following week. And that 6th homework assignment is going to be concerned with stress rules primarily. Okay, so let's come to talking now, first of all, about what stress is. So the first important thing to admit is that, of course, not all languages have stress. There are many languages, and those of us who have studied principally a lot of languages of Europe, we see that these are languages that tend in general to have stress. In some languages, in particular, many of the present-day North Germanic languages like Swedish and Norwegian seem to exhibit some interesting combinations of stress and pitch features in their languages. But of course, in many other languages of the world, there is no clear realization of some most prominent group of segments or some most prominent syllables. And even among the languages that clearly do have stress, the phonetic realization of stress is not totally uniform. This is precisely why this topic has been so difficult for phonologists to investigate, because there's not one single precise phonetic correlate that we can point to and say, yes, that is stress, this language possesses stress, that vowel or that syllable is a stressed vowel or a stressed syllable. However, depending upon the particular languages, there is an overall tendency in terms of phonetic correlates, that is in terms of phonetic properties, that stressed syllables exhibit. They're generally longer, that is, as comparison to the syllables that we can consider unstressed. Those unstressed syllables have a shorter duration. The stressed syllables are often louder, and the stressed syllables tend to be associated with certain pitch excursions. That is, the stressed syllable within a word becomes a target for the assignment of an intonational contour. So next week, we'll discuss a bit more of these intonational contours, but exactly whatever the utterance melody, the intonational contour that is being assigned within that word or phrase is, the stressed syllables will tend to attract those intonational contours. And these features And especially this last feature is something that makes stressed languages clearly distinct from so-called pitch accent languages. In pitch accent languages, a syllable that receives the prominence or accent, as one would call it in those languages, there's always the same tone or tone contour assigned to the prominent syllable. So in a classical stress language like English, the stress languages can be, the stress within a word can be associated with different pitch excursions, again, depending upon the intonational contour. Whereas in a pitch accent language, a classical pitch accent language like, say, Japanese, let's say in the Tokyo dialect, which we've looked at a little bit earlier in this course, there the prominent syllable, the syllable with the accent, will always have the same intonational pattern, and it won't really generally be disturbed by some other kind of intonational pattern coming from beyond the assignment of the prominence. Now, when rules of the language refer to stress, we sometimes see various properties, various changes happening. So, for instance, you could have a rule that says that an unstressed vowel needs to become non-low, or that a consonant, for instance, becomes aspirated at the beginning of a stressed syllable. We've seen rules of both of these sorts earlier in this course. For instance, in Brazilian Portuguese, we saw that the vowel a was raised to schwa, became non-low when it was unstressed. And in English, it's generally the case, not universally, there are further conditions, but typically voiceless consonants will become aspirated, will become plus spread glottis at the beginning of stressed syllables. And English itself presents a good example of a fairly extreme stress language. And this is why very often it's brought up as a canonical example of a stressed language, because in English, stressed syllables have essentially all three of these phonetic properties. They are universally longer, louder, and attract those intonational pitch contours to themselves. And moreover, there are a lot of various phonological rules in English that refer to stress, rules of vowel weakening, or sometimes perhaps even vowel deletion, rules like this one of voiceless stop aspiration that I just referred to. And we can contrast the situation in English with the role of stress in Spanish, where there's not a lot of difference, for instance, in duration between stressed and unstressed syllables. And there aren't a lot of rules in Spanish that change features of other segments, that change features of vowels or consonants and so on, because of properties of stress. And this difference between English and Spanish is also sometimes referred to as a difference between, in particular, the durational properties that have to do with stress, leads to the difference that is sometimes referred to as a stress timed language versus a syllable timed language. And in stress timed languages, it's typically like English. It's typically the case that we do find that these stressed syllables have perceptibly longer duration, measurably longer duration, whereas in syllable-timed languages like Spanish, each syllable, regardless of which syllable is to be considered stressed or not, they're more or less all of the same duration. So because stress, this abstract, if we want to think of it as an abstract phonological property, because stress doesn't always seem to cause the exact same phonetic properties, doesn't always seem to cause the exact same acoustic correlates to result in all languages, it's not something that we can directly hear or measure phonetically. As I said, it's not going to be possible to always point to some feature on the spectrogram and say, yes, there's the stress in this language. So for this reason, just as it was the case with syllable structure last week, when we see stress marks in a phonetic transcription, this in fact reflects a phonological analysis. That is where phonologists, based on phonetic information, the things that they can directly hear, and their further analytical steps have decided where they think the stress falls. Because there is some level of analysis required in order to arrive to stress, phonologists may disagree about the stress pattern of single words in a language whose stress patterns are relatively well understood, or they may disagree about how stress rules at all function in language. And they may even disagree about whether a language possesses stress at any level. That's the case. There are debates about Korean in this regard, or at what level of phonological structure stress is assigned, as in French. There are debates as to whether stress is assigned at the level of the word, or in fact at the level of the phonological phrase. It's clear that whether stress in French belongs at the word level or the phrase level, it goes at the right edge. But the question there is whether does the stress rule in French apply at this boundary, that is the word boundary, or does it apply at the phrase boundary, which would itself coincide with a word boundary. Okay, let's come now to thinking about how we may want to represent stress formally. We need some idea of what sort of notation we're going to adopt to formally represent stress before we can try to arrive to writing phonological rules that tell us which syllable or segment should be counted as stress. Whenever we have talked about stress in this course up to this point, we have always said that there are certain segments that can bear the feature minus stress or plus stress. And it has usually been the case that only vowels carry that feature. I guess we could imagine that any plus Slavic segment, even if it weren't technically a vowel, we could have given the feature stress to. Now that we have the ability, based on what we have learned last week, to group segments into syllables, it's probably more accurate to say that stress is a feature of syllables, because it seems reasonably clear that all the segments within a syllable need to have the same value for stress. So for instance, if we consider this rule of English, which would say, or a rule similar to it, which would say that consonants that become aspirated at the beginning of a stressed syllable, it might be easiest to acknowledge that, oh, those consonants somehow are associated with the feature stress. So let's see, in this example where the English word alligator, here we see stress as being a property of the syllables. So the segments, the vowels and the consonants, are grouped into syllables, and the syllables bear some features for stress. And here I am employing two features, namely the feature plus stress and the feature stress and the feature main. So stress is used to contrast stressed syllables with unstressed syllables. So in this word of English, the general analysis that most phonologists would apply is that there are two stressed syllables, but there's a distinction between a so-called primary and a secondary stress. And for that, I'm employing the feature main, where plus main marks which syllable has the primary stress. So in this word alligator, the primary stress falls on the leftmost syllable of the word, but there is a weaker degree of stress, secondary stress, falling on the third syllable. So in languages like English that distinguish between primary and secondary stress, as opposed to unstressed syllables, minus stress syllables, the phonetic correlates of stress that we've outlined above become a matter of degree. So this syllable with primary stress will be longer than all of the other syllables, but the syllable with secondary stress will be somewhat longer than these two unstressed syllables. And also important to note is that in this feature main that I've used here, is that in a stressed language, every content word, so all of the nouns and verbs and depending on the languages, the adjectives and perhaps some other word classes, those must have exactly one main stress. So not more and not less than one main stress. And that property we will refer to as culminativity. So the sort of stacking of prominences. So within a word, within a content word of a stress language, there is just one syllable with the main stress, but theoretically, a theoretically infinite number of syllables could have a secondary stress, and also an undefined number of syllables can be unstressed. In contrast to the content words, which typically need to have at least one and at most one main stress, the function words of stress languages, usually seen in, say, determiners and prepositions, or other so-called light or weak verbs, the auxiliary or modal verbs of the language, these word classes often don't have a stressed syllable unless they are placed in some sort of other phonological context, or placed under some sort of semantic conditions that require them to become stressed. So for instance, the English definite article, the, when it is unstressed, although we consider this to be a single morphological word, it doesn't have this property of requiring culminativity. For that reason, some phonologists would analyze these function words as not building independent phonological words, but rather becoming part of the phonological word of some other word. But in this perhaps emphasized context, in this case, maybe the definite article of English here does become an independent phonological word, and therefore does need to receive a stress. And segmentally, these two forms of the definite article are different from one another. So we see this, the definite article has these two allomorphs in English, unstressed the versus stressed the. Okay, now that we've quickly seen, what what phonetic properties are typical of stress, and we've talked briefly about how to represent stress using the features stress and main, and we've introduced the feature culminativity. We can pause briefly. Actually, let's continue for a moment. Let's finish this section on the distinction between phonemic and predictable stress before we take a break. So in some languages, it's the case that stress is totally predictable by rule. So for instance, in Finnish, stress always occurs on the first syllable without exception. So in languages like Finnish, we can assume that the underlying representations, the phonological underlying representations in Finnish have no stress. It is not necessary, and it would be superfluous for the underlying representations to be marked for a phonological property that can always be predicted by rules. So we would assume that in Finnish, that syllabification rules create syllables, groupings of segments that are initially minus stress, and then a phonological rule decides which syllables become plus stress and which of the plus stress syllables are assigned the value plus main. So in this sense, we think of the feature values minus stress and minus main for syllables as being the default settings for stress for a syllable. Now, in other languages, including English and Spanish, which we've already mentioned, stress is at least partly contrastive. So in Spanish, for instance, we can consider the famous minimal pair, sabana, a sheet, versus a savana, savanna, the type of landscape found in Africa. And English is famed for contrastive stress pairs that usually distinguish semantically related nouns and verbs. So in these cases, we find nouns like rebel versus verbs like rebel. And the typical pattern in this regard is that nouns will usually have stress on the first syllable of the word, whereas the verbs will have stress on the second syllable. And you can see that an effect of stress is that there are different vowel patterns. So in the second syllable of rebel, there's a syllabic lateral approximant, or maybe a schwa, whereas in the verb, there is a schwa in the first syllable, which is unstressed. So in order to account for these patterns, we probably need to assume that some plus syllabic segments are underlyingly marked as plus stress. So in those cases, the syllabification rules will then build a syllable which has the feature plus stress if the nucleus underlyingly has the value plus stress. However, there could be later rules that apply in the language that can change those stress features. So although there would need to be an underlying contrast between plus stress and minus stress vowels in English and Spanish, that contrast could be neutralized under certain conditions. A underlyingly plus stress syllable could be forced to become minus stress under certain conditions. All right, this is a good place to pause now that we've introduced the basic concepts of stress. And when we continue, we will talk about how to formulate rules for the assignment of stress.